14º Congresso Internacional de Jornalismo Investigativo da Abraji.
Hello. Bom dia. Hola. Ya me acabaron los idiomas. It's very nice to be here with all of you. One thing I'm going to tell you as I start is this is the first time I've ever done a PowerPoint presentation. It was inspired by my new friend here, Mago, who did a really spectacular one yesterday. So this is not that good. In fact, I decided that what I really wanted to be in life is not a reporter, but an art director. So it's basically, except for this, it's all pictures. Hopefully that will work for you. But I'm here today to talk a little bit about how stories about big and important people develop, and how, as journalists, we can sometimes fall into stories just by doing our job, and how one story can develop into another in ways that are very surprising. So I'm going to tell a little bit about a story. But since they mentioned Marin, I wanted to tell an off-point story about that, just because I think Brazilians are often very interested in this José Maria Marin. So does anyone not know who José Maria Marin is? Everyone knows about him? Good. So he was arrested on May 27th, 2015 in a very fancy hotel in Zurich, Switzerland. And he was staying there for the FIFA Congress, which is the annual meeting of all the cartolas de FIFA. And at 6 in the morning, Swiss police knocked on his hotel room door. And they opened the door, and they arrested him in front of his wife. And his wife was very upset. They'd been married for 50 or more years. She was very upset to see her husband being arrested. She didn't know what was going on. And so she picked up the telephone in her hotel room, and she called someone else in the hotel. She called another Brazilian whose name is Marco Polo de Nero. Has everyone heard of him? She called up Marco Polo, and she said, Marco Polo, help me, ayuda, ayuda. Come to my room, please. Come to my room. They're taking my husband. I don't know what to do. So he says, oh, this is terrible. I'll come there right away. And then he hangs up the phone. Can anyone guess what Marco Polo de Nero did next? Anyone? He packed up his bag, and he went downstairs, and he took a taxi to the airport, and he flew to Brazil, and it's been 5 years, and he has never left Brazil since that day. But one of the very first things he did upon returning to Brazil was to take José Maria Marin, his name was on the building for the CBF headquarters, was to take his name off the building. So that's my little side story. But I think what I want to tell you about is a sort of a narrative, a story about how one thing turned into another and back into the other, and how they all sort of revolved around themselves kind of by accident. So I'm going to start with my first picture. Does anyone know who that is? Anyone? I mean, Papa Noel, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Una Pirata, El Diablo. This is Chuck Blazer. Chuck Blazer he's dead now, an American, the most important American figure in history in football. He was the United States representative on the FIFA Executive Committee. He was the General Secretary of CONCACAF, which is the Confederation of Football in North America and Central America and the Caribbean. He was extremely powerful, and no one in the US had heard of him. It's a very strange thing. Marin Del Nero Teixeira before, I don't think they could go out to the park and just no one would bother them, right? If Del Nero was walking in the park, reporters would talk to him, the general public would talk to him, ask him questions. Why did the team play so bad against Paraguay, for example? But this guy could walk around New York and no one cared. completely anonymous, even though he was one of the 24 most powerful people in the world of soccer. This is also spectacularly surprising because he did things like that. He dressed like that. He also weighed about 200 kilos. He was a very, very big man. And I forgot a photo, but he often walked around with a parrot on his shoulder. This is true. So he's a very unique character. And I learned about him when I was working at the LA Times, which is the Los Angeles Times where I worked before. I had an editor there who was from Trinidad, and he used to talk about another cartola de football. His name was Jack Warner. He was from Trinidad, and he was extremely corrupt. And his best friend was this guy. So every time he would tell me stories about Chuck Blazer, I would go and I would Google and look up who this guy is, and there would always be a story about this guy. And I thought, well, here's a story that no one's told, at least not where I live. No one has heard of this man who's incredibly powerful and influential in football. And so when I started at BuzzFeed News was just starting an investigations team. They wanted to try new and big and exciting things, so I proposed a very big profile of this man that no one's heard of because the World Cup was coming here in Brazil. And so I spent several months reporting on this guy, learning everything I could, and what I figured out was that he was extremely corrupt. Right? It was very clear this was a very corrupt person. So I wrote an article about this man. An example of his corruption, and what the article was called Mr. 10%. And he was called Mr. 10%, or that was the nickname for him, because he wrote himself a contract, an employment contract with CONCACAF, so that 10% of every single dollar that came into CONCACAF would go to him every year, 10%. And then he would take that money and he would put it in a bank account in the Bahamas or in the Cayman Islands, and he would hide it from the government and not pay taxes on it, and all these kinds of things that perhaps you've heard about here in Brazil. That article came out 2 days before the World Cup here in Brazil, which he didn't attend because he was very sick with cancer. And it later turned out for another reason, because 1 year later, Marin and 6 other people were arrested in a hotel in Zurich. And 2 days later, the US government announced that this man was the most important cooperator in the case, along with one other. They didn't announce this other one, but he was the most important cooperator they announced. There was another cooperator, also Brazilian, Jota Avila, was secretly helping the government as well. So at this point, the story that I wrote a year earlier suddenly explodes, becomes viral on the internet. The story had many more views a year after I wrote it than when I first wrote it. I don't know how many of you have experience with this, but it's very unusual for an article you wrote a year ago to have a second life, right? I mean, in the US, we have an expression about articles. And this comes from the good old days when people used to read print newspapers. Probably for most of you, that's a very strange idea, but that's how I grew up. We call an old article fish wrap. Has anyone ever heard that? Yeah. Fish wrap, right? Because what do you wrap fish in newspapers? It's the only thing an old article is good for, is to wrap fish. But what I didn't know at that point I had the opportunity to write a book. So there was so much interest in this article, in my fish wrap, that people said, well, why don't, there's so much more about this. This is a giant story. The whole world is talking about this story. That's all they're talking about. Why don't you do something more? And what I didn't know is that writing about this guy would lead to writing about this guy. And it didn't even occur to me the incredible, strange connections between these two people until I began digging into this story a little bit. But I should have included when I started seeing things like this. This is Chuck Blazer in 2010, visiting the Kremlin. Actually, this was in the, he was the prime minister at the time, not the president of Russia. So he was visiting in the secondary building there. And this, of course, is from, this is actually from 2018, that's not right. But anyway, this is a photo of them together not that long ago. as I was reporting this book and trying to learn about the world of futebol and all the people, and remember, I'm just an American guy. We hardly know anything about the sport. We're it's true, we're terrible at it, and I didn't know anything about it. I never played the sport, and so I had to. And I also wasn't really a sports reporter. I mean, as mentioned in my introduction, I wrote about broken cars, people who die in them, and I wrote about immigration and about human trafficking and all these things that had nothing to do with sport. So I had to learn this whole giant culture, and that touches on one of the themes of this, which is it's a culture full of really powerful people who don't want outsiders sticking their nose in their business. And so I found that reporting it was incredibly difficult. People were very hostile to me being involved. I would travel all over the world. I would go to Zurich. I would go to South America. I would go to Argentina, to London, and all these places, and people didn't want to tell me anything because I was an outsider. I'm just gonna see if I think the next slide might not be helpful. So we're gonna do a sneak peek. Yeah. So this is basically what my reporting was for the first year or so.
Do you mind if I just switch chairs?
I don't care. This is what my reporting usually is most of my time every day. These are court documents. I spend my entire life looking at court documents, going to courts, pulling court documents, and reading them. These are a few pages from the indictment. I think it's in Portuguese, indiciamento, is that the word? Yeah, indiciamento. Of the FIFA case, right? So this is the cover page, this is the table of contents. The whole thing is 240 pages long, all the complications of all the corruption in this sport. And I spent all my time getting information from this because no one would talk to me and no one would help me. And my whole goal in life, this is through 2016 into the end of 2016, my whole goal in life is to find somebody who will talk to me about what's going on in the football case, who these people really are, what's the real story, what really happened behind closed doors. And all I get is just a bunch of court documents, which are very helpful, but as a reporter you want more, as a journalist you want the secret thing that nobody knows, right? You're gonna write a book, you don't wanna write a book that we call it a clip job, right? Where you take clippings from other people's articles, you read them, and then you reassemble it into a book. It's fine, serves a purpose, but you want something new. You have the ambition that your story is going to tell a story that no one else has heard. What you're really hoping is that even the people who made the case get mad at you when the book comes out, the story comes out, because you know something that they didn't want anyone to know, or that they didn't know. So then one day in late 2016, after the US presidential election, I'm in San Francisco. I live in Los Angeles, by the way, and I'm outside of San Francisco in Berkeley, which is where the big university is. And I'm in the house of this strange man who was the editor of a publication called Soccer America. And I'm looking at his paper archives, hoping to find something interesting. It's a terrible archive, it's a terrible publication, there's nothing useful. I'm there for 6 hours. And my phone rings, and the person says, are you able to travel this weekend? We have something very important to tell you. This is the call we all want to get, right? I have something important to tell you. My whole life is focused on the football case. It's all I can think about. My wife and my children. The thing I should have put in this PowerPoint is the card my son gave me for Christmas that year, and it's just like, have you ever seen these things where it's a blank comic book, like and you can make it yourself? So all it is a picture of a man, and then in every word bubble it just says FIFA, 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 FIFA. Felt very bad when I got that from my son. So I get this phone call and they say, okay, are you available to travel, and can you come up to San Francisco? And I said, well, it's an amazing coincidence because I'm in San Francisco. So they say, great, rent a car and drive to this place, and we have something important to tell you. So I rent a car and I drive to this place, and on the way, it turns out that it's out in the mountains in the woods. And it turns out that in the woods there, even though it's not that far from Apple headquarters, my phone's map gets very confused. The backup map gets confused. The third map gets confused. I end up in the middle of nowhere at night. The car goes off the road, stuck in the mud. I can't get the car out of it, so I have to abandon the car and walk through the forest. There's animals everywhere, right? So I don't know, here we go. So this is what I did. I walked through the forest, and I think there's mountain lions here, pumas, right? I think there's a puma that's going to eat me. So I take out the weapon we all carry as journalists, and I go. And I walk through the night like this, ready for the puma. And I heard animals all around me. And then the moon came out, and so I had a little light. And there were cows. There were cows everywhere. So I finally got rescued. I found the one spot with a little bit of signal, and I stood there and I called the people, and they came and rescued me. It was a very sort of not the most dignified way, perhaps, to meet a source who's going to tell you everything about football, right? So they dragged me out of there, and we found some very angry kind of farmer man who used his truck to tow the car out of the mud. He looked like his wife had come out and looked like she might go for a gun. So it was all very tense. We went to the house, and we get into the room, and there's all these sort of very important, not important men, but men who think of themselves as being masters of the universe, who have all the information. And we have a couple of drinks, and I'm very excited. What are they going to tell me? What are they going to tell me about Avila? What are they going to tell me about Marin? What are they going to tell me about all these people? And they say, oh, we're here to talk to you about this guy, which is a very surprising thing for me to hear. And they said, did you know that the man who was just elected president of the United States is a Russian spy? Yes, that's great, but what about Avila? What about Chuck Blazer? We don't have anything for you on that, but we have this other thing that you might be interested in. It turns out that we think he's a spy. We think that Russia interfered in the election. We think that Russia has interfered in elections all over the world. We think this is an important story. I agree, but what about football? And they said, well, the reason we want you here is because there's a connection between the football and the scandal and what we think is a big deal about Trump. And what it was that the man who started this case, this British spy that she mentioned, also did the investigation of Trump. So this is a British spy, and he was hired in 2010 by England when England was trying to get the rights to host the World Cup. And he provided information to the FBI about what he thought was Russian, how should we say, inappropriate behavior with regard to trying to get the World Cup. That led to the FBI opening its investigation. It's very complicated how it went forward, but it would never have happened without this guy. And this same guy, Christopher Steele, was hired by these men I told you about in the house in the woods with the mountain lions and the cows. He was hired by them in 2016 to look into what Trump did with Russia or not during the election. And when he finished his report, he gave it to the same FBI agent who opened this case. So they contacted me because they thought, well, this guy knows everyone in that world. And so he'll be the person to really understand how this works in this other world. This, by the way, was a ridiculous assumption on their part. I didn't know anyone in the football world, but they assumed that I must know. And so they told me about this document. They wouldn't give it to me, but they told me about it. And I drove home the next day, didn't get stuck in the mud, and my hair was standing on end. This was a very wild thing to hear, a very strange and crazy thing to hear. But it also resonated in a way that nobody knew about, and I never told anyone about it until I wrote the book, which was that 4 months earlier, I don't know how many months earlier, in June of 2016, I had a meeting with a lawyer of one of the people who was indicted in this case. His name's one of these names. And he said, I have to tell you how my client, of all the people arrested in Zurich, didn't get extradited to the US. And I said, well, how did that happen? He said, well, it was really simple. It was the Russians. I said, what do you mean? Well, his client was a Uruguayan named Eugenio Figueredo. And of the 7 people arrested that day, every single one of them, 6 got extradited to the US, but he got extradited to Uruguay. And the lawyer said the way it happened is the Russians reached out to me, made contact with me, and told me the way to get him out of the US and into South America. And now this kind of thing, at least for us in North America, this kind of story about Russia seems like we hear them every day. But at that time in June 2016, it seemed like a crazy story to me. It wasn't the mentality. In a sense, I think part of the whole story about fake news and about Russia and disinformation and all that is something we had to learn to understand, because it wasn't something any of us were thinking about. And now I think we all think it's very familiar to think about the way that bad information is out there and influences all of our opinions if we're not careful. When I heard that story about Russia in June of 2016, I just thought it was very strange. When I'm sitting in this house in the mountains in December 2016, everything starts snapping together. So then I spent about a month trying to find this report that they told me about but they wouldn't give me. And I ultimately found it. And I gave it to my editors, and I started reporting it and traveling and went to London and went to other places to try to confirm this information. This is a 35-page report. I don't know how well known this report is here in South America, but this was full of information that everyone thought was crazy. And on January 10th, 2017, 11 days before President Trump would be inaugurated, would become formally the president, my editors decided to publish the whole document. At the time, I was on vacation at Disney World with my family. This is a true story. And I was there with my wife and my 2 children, and our friends from Argentina were there as well. And I'm the foreign editor. They put their names on there because they said, we don't want you to have to do this alone. You did all the work, but we don't want you to be naked by yourself, so we're putting our names on it. Okay. When it published, I got a phone call about 5 minutes later from the person who gave me this document, because these yellow marks on it were his highlighting. We did it in such a hurry that we didn't even clean up the document. This is not the best, and honestly not the best practice. I wish we hadn't done it. And he called me up and he said, oh my God, my highlighting is on the internet. Is there technology to detect highlighting? I don't think so. I think you're okay. So this article came out, it exploded. I've never had an article anywhere near this in terms of how many people looked at it and how much happened. And then I thought my phone rang a lot on the Splash Mountain ride, but then my phone rang and buzzed continuously for 24 hours. So I just turned it off. And this led to this crazy thing where suddenly I wasn't writing about football anymore. I was writing about Trump and Russia, which is to me a very dramatic turn away from where I had been intending to go. And also, strangely, my editor at the publishing house where the book was supposed to be didn't care. He just wanted his book about the FIFA scandal. And so I had to try to sort of answer it both. The incredible hunger for information about this, and at the same time try to solve the riddle about the soccer case. And it's interesting, the other thing that happened is the day after this ran, a new source I had on the football investigation, who I was very excited to meet. We were going to go, and like a week later, we were going to meet in New York and spend a couple days together. He called me up and he said, I can't talk to you anymore. I can't talk to you anymore after what happened after the publication. It's too hot. It's too hot. I can't talk to you anymore. So I lost a couple sources because of that, but I gained a couple sources because of it as well. It led to some other consequences. I can't remember what my next slide is, so I'm going to do a quick sneak preview. Yeah, okay, this is one of the consequences. So remember a few minutes ago I said that I told my editors that if we publish these, we're going to get sued? We got sued. We got sued once, twice, and the third time by him. Does anyone know who that is? Yeah? Who's that? Wow, impressed. Yes, that's Michael Cohen. That was Trump's personal lawyer. He sued us. He sued me. Then when they arrested him, because he's a criminal, he dropped the lawsuit. This guy sued us, and he is a Russian internet entrepreneur, Alexei Gubarev, and he sued us. He runs a bunch of very strange, shady internet servers and other things that allow people to run spam and pornography and all kinds of things on the internet. And people use his servers to commit fraud. There's a thing called the meth bot where they would use the server to create fake advertising clicks, so that sites that pay, companies that pay per click would pay them money, and so they would use like zombie computer farms to generate clicks through the server, and they stole $30 million or something. And then these people sued us too, and this is the principals of Alpha Bank, which is like the third or fourth biggest bank in Russia. The good news is that this lawsuit, eventually we won that lawsuit. As I said before, he had other bigger problems and decided to stop wasting his time with us, and this one is still pending. So I sort of have the satisfaction of being able to tell my editor I was right, but at the same time, I wish I wasn't right. While this is going on, as I said before, I'm trying to finish my book, and these new sources are developing, and suddenly, it's this, as I said, this project of one sort of big hard project has become two, what I found was resistance everywhere, because as difficult as it was to report about FIFA and all people not wanting me to be involved in that, reporting about the president, the U.S. president, and all the stuff around him was sort of equally or even more so difficult. So my life really got hard. The time with my son and my wife and my daughter got even less. But finally I was able to produce a book. Let's see if that's the next slide. That's the next slide. So there's another story about dealing with difficult people here. So this is the book. That's how it published in the U.S. This is how it published in Spanish-speaking Latin America. This is how it published in Portugal. It also sold here in Brazil, because you can't buy it in Brazil. The company that purchased it is called Globo Livros. Globo bought the rights to the book at the same time as everyone else in the summer of 2015. But in November of 2017, let me just take a step back. In August of 2017, I turned in the manuscript to my book, and then started editing the book. And then in November 2017, our friend Jose Maria Marin, along with a Peruvian and Paraguayan, went up and had a trial in New York. So this is sort of a reporter's dream and nightmare at the same time, because the trial is amazing and interesting and fascinating, but also the trial is supposed to happen before your deadline, right? Not after your deadline. And so I had to get an extension on the book and go cover the trial for 6 weeks. And the other thing is, you're terrified in a trial that information that you worked so hard to get and that you flew to Miami 5 times to get and did all these things to get, they're just going to put it out there in the courtroom for the whole world. But during the trial, there was all this interesting testimony about all kinds of corruption that we'd never heard about, including some corruption by this company called Globo. There was 2 days of testimony about corruption by Globo, and people naming Globo executives and discussing bribes paid by Globo executives for the rights to football, right? That Globo executives were meeting with the Cartolas, and they were meeting with other executives from other television things. There was Torneos from Argentina, Televisa from Mexico, and they would meet together and they would discuss how much they were going to pay to different officials so that they could get the rights for Libertadores, for Copa America, and for Copa Mundial. Globo was not very happy with that testimony. And so I rewrote part of my book, and I mentioned Globo a couple times and some other things, and then finished the book after the trial, and the book was sent to Globo in February, along with everybody else, February or March of 2018. The manuscript was sent to Globo, and Globo translated the book, and they laid it out, and they sent it to my friend who works for Globo to read and to write a review. So he showed me that he had the PDF of the book translated. And then the date came, and they didn't publish the book. And then we inquired, and they said, oh, there's a translation problem. Well, this is clearly not true, because I know it exists already translated. And they said, oh, there's a publication date problem. It's a bad time. And it kept going like this, month after month after month. They wouldn't publish. And then finally they said, okay, we'll publish your book if you agree to one thing. Well, what's the one thing? Take every mention of Globo out of the book. And then we'll publish your book. And I said, absolutely not, right? If I said yes, I wouldn't be here today. And so they wouldn't do it. And then they said, okay, well, we're just going to wait until this whole criminal case is over, and then maybe we'll publish it. Well, I don't know how much you know about the American justice system, but prosecutors there don't ever stand up and go, this case is closed. Maybe in the movies, but it doesn't happen. They just leave it, they just leave it there. It's just quiet. There's no formal closure ever. So that's meaningless. So Globo made it very clear, and this goes back to the idea of sort of dealing with important, powerful people. Globo said, we're not going to publish this. By the way, they paid me. I mean, it wasn't a lot of money, but they paid. I got the money that I was supposed to get for the book. But they're happy to just swallow the money rather than let this come out there. And I find it absurd, because there's nothing that I have in there that wasn't already said in the courtroom in public, right? So it's out there anyway. It's in articles that you could read in Foya or all the other places that were covering it. But this was their way of trying to prevent me from publishing, the same way that these people sued because they didn't want it published, and they wanted, if you think about why they would sue us, really the message they're sending is not to me, but to other media, right? Don't publish anything more negative, because you're going to get sued, and we're going to destroy your company or destroy you. So Globo's way, I think, of stopping people saying bad things about Globo is just to pay the money and refuse to publish the book. So, but there may be a happy ending with your help, which is that we read the contract very carefully, and it says that if they don't publish within 18 months of when they get the manuscript, we can break the contract. So, hopefully, I can find a Brazilian publisher who wants to publish the book, and my fantasy is that it'll come out, and on the cover, it'll say, like right here, it'll say, the book that Globo didn't want you to read. This is what I'm hoping for. I think that might be my last slide. Let me make sure. Yeah, that's it. So that's it. That's my presentation. I want you to applaud me for my wonderful presentation. Kidding. I'm very proud of my PowerPoint skills. I'm going to talk to Mago afterwards to get info on it. But as a reporter, I think the takeaway from these kinds of projects, so many wires, about one thing leading to another, is I think that keeping yourself open to sort of how big a story can really be, and also taking the risk to talk to anyone with any kind of crazy idea, can really lead to unexpected activities. Now, I'm really lucky because I got the opportunity to spend a year and a half of my life, learning everything I could about one particular topic. And I know for most journalists, particularly young journalists, the idea of spending that much time on one topic seems impossible. When I tell younger reporters how long I spend on any story, they're usually shocked, right? I can spend easy 6 months or a year on stories. It's common. And that's shocking, because I know a lot of us, when we're younger, have to do, 1, 2, or 3 stories a day, right? It's just a demand, especially now, to write more and more. But when you get a chance to spend more time on a project and to get deeper on a project and to make new kinds of sources and to go into new areas where you feel incredibly uncomfortable because you don't understand any of it, you can be really surprised at what comes to you. So I think that's my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about futebol or about Trump or about mountain lions. So.
Alright, you can. Vocês podem levantar a mão para fazer a pergunta e aí eu vou coordenando.
Do you want to be further wired?
I mean, I'll try. I'll do as a backup. Yeah, I prefer it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, directly?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, can
Pode falar português que eu traduzo para ele, como você quiser. Pode falar inglês também.
tá bom, falar inglês.
Tem
So
que só
you were-
falar alto pra gente, pra poder traduzir.
You were dealing with a lot of dangerous and powerful people in your article. Have you ever suffered any threats or had any fear about what may happen? Something like that.
Yeah. When I wrote about years ago, I wrote about Toyota and these problems they had, and what we were finding was that people were dying in Toyotas because the cars were driving themselves, essentially. There's a lot of people who are very loyal to Toyota, and so it's funny. It seems funny to those of us who aren't this way, but some people feel the way about cars brands that other people feel about football clubs or about political parties, right? So it turns out there are people who love Toyota, like some people love Palmeiras or something, and
Can you explain a little bit about the Toyota story?
oh, sure. So, sorry, that's right. Why would they know that? So there was a horrible accident in San Diego, California, that was recorded. So the horrible accident was that a car with a whole family of 5 people in it, father, 3 children, I think a father, mother, 2 children, and an uncle were in a car, and it drove off on its own, and it wouldn't stop. And they called emergency. They called what we have as 911. Is it 911 here? I don't know. 119? 190. They called 190, and they're recorded there. So you can, as a reporter, you can actually usually get copies of the recordings of any call if you know what to ask for. So they record it, and it's a terrible, terrifying recording of, for 45 seconds, these people, or a minute and a half, saying the car won't stop. It's going 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers, 200 kilometers an hour, and it won't stop. And it's going straight down the freeway. And they're screaming, right, help, and they're praying to God. And then it crashes, and they die, all 5 of them, right? It's horrible. So this no one knew what the cause of this was, and I started looking into it. Why would this happen? And it led to a big investigation that showed that, in fact, there seemed to be some electronical issues with these cars that Toyota didn't want to talk about. There was other issues with the cars. There was problems with the design of where the pedal was and how the pedal worked, and the pedal would stick, and a million other things. And ultimately, it led to the government telling Toyota to stop selling cars in America. They had to stop all sales of cars for a couple of days. And then they had to recall all these cars, and it was a big mess. And then they paid a $1.5 billion fine to the U.S. government. But the Toyota fans of the world, the people who really love Toyota, were very offended by this, and strangely would get death threats from Toyota owners. And they would say things like, you just love Ford, that's what it is. You love Honda. So mostly not Honda, mostly Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. They thought I was some sort of like nationalist, like an auto nationalist. It's funny too, because most of the Toyotas that were having the problems were manufactured in the US, not in Japan. So that was sort of the first time I ever got kind of threats, but I didn't take them too seriously. With FIFA, I kind of was worried that people would threaten me. Mostly they were just horrible to me. They just were rude and unhelpful and would lie to me and close the door in my face. And I remember I flew to to Zurich for the election of the new president after the previous president, Sepp Blatter, was forced to resign. They had an election for the new president, and I went to see it, and they had it in a hockey arena. And the hockey arena in Zurich holds 15,000 people. The entire FIFA delegation, plus the press, plus everyone else, was about 3,000, 4,000 people. I flew to Zurich to go to this, and I showed up, and they said, "Oh, actually, you can't go in. There's no room." Right? When we know you're writing a book, and unfortunately, there's no room for book authors in the stadium, which has 11,000 empty seats in it. So there was a lot of that kind of thing. But then when we published that dossier, that's when it got a little bit scary. That it turns out that people care more about politics even than Toyota. And that was, there was a lot of sort of direct threats on me, but also against my family. People were somehow figuring out what my wife and children's name are, and on Twitter and elsewhere saying, you know, I saw Patricia, Sofia, and Matteo in the park, that kind of stuff. So for a few days it was pretty scary, but in the end, nothing really happened. The biggest threat ultimately I got was these people who tried to sue me in court and take all my money. So that was the worst thing that's ever happened. Certainly some journalists, you know, I assumed, by the way, that my email and anything like that could be intervened, could be hacked. I think that I'm not sure it is. It probably isn't, but I sort of proceed when I do my work in writing, assuming it is. So one thing I learned from all my reporting, but particularly covering these two things, is never write anything down that you don't want to see printed on some website or on Twitter in the future. So as a journalist, a good tip is if you have something important to say it on the phone. It's possible your phone could be recorded, this is true, but usually it's not, and there's no record. So if you ever get sued, or if you ever get anything, there's no document, there's no message anywhere that anyone can read and really embarrass you. So you'll notice with lawyers in particular, lawyers hate writing things down. They like to talk on the phone or meet in person, and that sort of applies to that as well. The other is to use a messaging app like Signal. I don't know if you have that here. It works like WhatsApp, but it's more secure. It's not owned by Facebook, which is very nice. And you can set it so I really recommend, this is off my point of my thing, but I really recommend you get Signal, all of you as journalists. You can set it so the messages disappear in a certain amount of time, and on both ends. So if you and I have a conversation, I can set it to disappear in one day. And if I set that, you can't unset it. It will disappear for both of us in one day. So it's very useful, and it's end-to-end encrypted, which means that even Signal can't read the messages. No one except for you and the other person can read the messages. So as long as and they're not stored on the cloud, they're only stored on the devices, so that even if they get access to, the government has a subpoena and they get access to the servers, there's nothing there. And as long as it disappears from the phones, even if they get your phone, there's nothing there. So I really highly recommend that. That was a long answer, sorry.
Hi, my name is Fernanda, and we've been having a lot of fake news since Trump and even before, and I was wondering if you had to deal with it around your stories about Trump and Putin. I imagine yes, and how did you deal with it?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Probably one of my favorite stories I've done in a long time was exactly about that. After we published that what we call the Trump dossier or the Steele dossier, I started getting a lot of tips. People like, you know, it says if you hold up a big flag saying, you know, send me stories. And most of them were just crazy, useless stuff. But one seemed amazing. It was amazing. It was this man in Israel who told me that he had documents showing that Exxon, the giant oil company, Exxon had funneled money through France and Hong Kong to send it back to the Republican Party and to Trump's campaign. And so that Exxon had paid $1 billion basically through overseas accounts to the Trump campaign. And the thing about that was really interesting about it was that Trump had named as his Secretary of State, which is like the foreign minister, right? Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson had been the chief executive of Exxon, right? So the whole thing looked like Exxon was paying essentially a bribe to Trump so that Tillerson, their corporate president, could become the Secretary of State and be enormously influential, particularly with regard to oil policy around the world, right? The Secretary of State can go to Russia or to Brazil or any of these places and negotiate deals that have to do with oil. Not only did he say he had this, but he had documents to prove it. And he sent me the documents. And, you know, a lot of times you get crazy theories, but there's no documents. Well, here I had a document. It showed the wire transfers. I had internal memorandum from Exxon, had all this stuff. And I got two of the reporters, and we went crazy looking at this. This is going to be a giant story. And things started to sort of feel wrong. Something felt wrong about the story. And the more I looked into it, the more things seemed wrong. One of the numbers was wrong on the bank transfer thing. There was a spelling error on an email. All these little things started to add up, and I started reporting. When I called the Israeli, well, where did you get this? How'd you get this? And he started telling me the story. And I'm starting to get resistant to publishing. And then he says to me, just publish it. You published the dossier. Just publish this too, the same way. Just publish. So this really made me nervous. So I spent more time, and it turns out I learned the story, which is that he went to a cafe in Rome, and in Milan, and met a strange man who charged him $5,000 for these documents, and he paid for them. Because this Israeli guy was a political activist. He was a supporter of Hillary Clinton, even though he was an Israeli, but he was sort of part of these people who support Democrats, and he had found money to pay for this and get the document. But then we researched the guy he got the document from, and that guy turns out to be all over the internet as a scammer, as someone who goes around and pretends to be an aristocrat from Liechtenstein. He pretends to be a member of the British royal family. He pretends to be a computer hacker. He pretends to be all these different crazy things. It was all very clear that something was really wrong. And the more we looked into it, and we called Exxon, and we called the banks, and we called everyone, it was all made up. And so we published what we did instead of just throwing this away like you do with bad ideas. We published a big long story about this thing that's fake, and how it's not just the Russians and not just sort of these kind of outside actors circulating fake news, but it's actually activists on the other side of the political spectrum with different motivations who are pushing fake news. And I'm really happy about the story because it was very fun to do, but also because it became an important piece to show people that fake news happens all over the place. It's not just from one place. And so all the Trump supporters who hated me after I published the dossier now loved me, right? Because I had just shown that Trump sometimes is a victim of fake news. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the idea.
Yeah, so I would like to ask you about the Russian investigation that's currently going on. What do you think about critics on the left, like Glenn Greenwald, who say that there was no Russian meddling of that, and that the media is going to pay a high price for going full in on that story?
So Greenwald, I guess, is kind of a big deal here in Brazil right now. He's an interesting character, separate from the question you had, which is I see him as someone. I mean, I was a big fan of Glenn Greenwald many years ago, 10 or so, 12 years ago, because I thought he had very interesting, provocative, intelligent things to say about the way the U.S. conducted foreign policy. But he's also, I think, someone who craves attention and has learned that the best way to get attention, and this is, I think, a lot of us are tempted by this, which is to say the most controversial and non-obvious thing in as loudly as possible in as many public forums as possible. And I think that the way sort of television media and Twitter and other things work right now is it encourages you to be controversial and to say things that are critical of other people. And you end up, I think you can end up pushed into avenues that are far from where you started based on the way that you're received. So to give an idea, he used to be someone who would appear on left-wing, sort of progressive television and talk about how bad the government is. And now he's on right-wing television talking about how bad the government is. And I don't think he has bad intentions, but I think that he has made a business of criticizing, other media. I think that's been a successful thing for him. So that's my background feeling about him. I think he's wrong about the Russian meddling. The fact of the matter is that there have been several criminal investigations and indictments of Russians for meddling, and I don't think there's any question what this huge investigation, what's called the Mueller investigation or the special counsel investigation in the U.S., showed very clearly is that Russians interfered in the election. And I think it's very clear they have evidence. They have, you can see in the documents, you can see fake Facebook pages, fake Google accounts, fake Twitter accounts that were created and used by Russian trolls to interfere specifically in the U.S. election. So if Greenwald thinks that's not true, I think he's dead wrong, and I think the Mueller report and other things show that. As to whether Trump actually was a Russian spy, as alleged in that thing, that's a little more complicated. And I think one of the legacies of this document we published is that maybe it wasn't totally right, and that if you read all 35 pages of that dossier, there's a lot of stuff that clearly is right. There's a lot of it about Russian meddling in the election and the activities that Russia was up to. But as to whether Trump was a spy, or Trump had this, I'm embarrassed to say it, but this very graphic incident in a hotel room in Russia, which some of you have probably heard about, or whether Michael Cohen secretly traveled to Prague to meet with people, these things are a little less clear and might not be very true. And then the question is, well, if they're not perfectly true, is that because the whole thing is fake news? Was it a plot, the way fake news is, to generate an outcome? Or was it carelessness or overambition, or what the cause was? So I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I think that the publication of this document is very complicated. I spent a lot of time considering and reconsidering whether it was the right thing to do. Traditionally, as journalists, we don't publish things we don't believe is true. And in this case, we published a document we didn't believe was false or true. We didn't know. And we made a decision to publish it because we felt it was important for the public to understand what was going on. The reason we made that decision was because we knew that the FBI had the document. We knew that President Trump had seen the document. We knew that President Obama had seen the document. We knew that several members of the Senate and Congress had seen the document, and that it was being used to make the government make decisions. Therefore, we decided the public has a right to know this. It's influencing their lives, whether or not it's true. In this sense, the allegations become separate. We're not interested in that moment in the allegations. We're interested in this document as a thing that causes people to behave. And that was the justification that caused a judge to rule in our favor and to throw out the case. But I do think there's still a lot of mystery about what really happened. And I don't know if we'll know. And I think Greenwald is good for asking the questions. I just don't always agree with why he's asking them. No questions about yeah.
Hi. So I wonder when do you think you're gonna end up since the election in the US is coming up again, with all the investigation around Trump and all that.
What?
I mean, because Americans have been saying that Kanye is gonna be the next president. So what do you think is gonna happen in the next US election?
I mean, normally I would say I will bet you every dollar I have that Kanye will not be president. But then to be honest, like I would have said that about Donald Trump in 2015. So there's some great clips of all these TV people and famous people saying, "I promise you, Donald Trump will never be president. I promise you. I promise you." Yeah. Well, that probably happened with Bolsonaro too, right? People said it'll never be president.
Do you think Bernie Sanders?
So you want to know who's going to win? Is that what it is?
Not exactly, but do you think Trump would be elected again?
I think it's very important. It's important for us as journalists, right, to be neutral, right? But we all have feelings in our heart, and I would be very delighted if Donald Trump was not president anymore. I think it would be better for the whole world. There's a couple other presidents around the world that I feel the same way about.
But I mean, do you think the public opinion is gonna change?
I think he's got to be the favorite. I think if you had to bet, he still has the best chance of winning, which is kind of shocking. But I think his ability, he is in a strange way, although I don't think he's a particularly intelligent person, I think he is very good at messaging. He's very clear in coming up with a clear and understandable message. I think a lot of us would agree it's an offensive and disturbing message, but it's very clear and easy to understand. And I think the public reacts very well, the voters react very well to very simple, easy to understand concepts. The problem with a Bernie Sanders or something is most people don't really know what he stands for. People who love him do, but most people don't. They just think it's like anti-Trump, crazy communist socialist. They don't know what it is, right?
We're going to exactly prove that here, so we need some hope.
Well, I mean, look, I think I would like to live in a world where like complicated and sophisticated messaging is what voters vote for, right? But I think, unfortunately, what we're actually moving to more, even more, with the internet, with Twitter, with the way TV has changed. I mean, TV used to have, I don't know if it's the same here, but CNN in the US, for example, you would have reporters go out and do reports, and they would look at things, they would be there in the scene, and they would interview people. And now it's just 6 people in a room screaming at each other, right? About ideas. There's almost no actual new journalism. It's just people offering their opinion. And if you look at Twitter, I try really hard, but I'm terrible at Twitter because I don't really feel comfortable screaming my opinion all the time, right? But if you look at people who are successful on Twitter or on Instagram, maybe a little less Instagram, you just have to be beautiful there. But it's just screaming out your opinion all the time and messaging and having this distinct voice, like Greenwald kind of has a distinct voice. And he's very good at it. And so if the Democrats can find someone who's really good at messaging and is crystal clear and understandable, that could really help them. I think that one other thing is, and someone else was saying this the other day, is the economy, right? If you talk to typical Brazilians or typical Americans, most of them don't care that much as long as they have a job and as long as they can pay their bills, right? That's their general opinion about politics is, do I have a job and is my family okay? And as long as they have a job and their family's okay, people don't want change. People want change when they have problems. Well, in the US, unemployment, the rate of unemployment is the lowest it's been in 50 years, 60 years. So everyone has a job. Not everyone, obviously, but most people who are looking for jobs can find jobs. Now, some of them are bad jobs. I mean, they're all, they're driving Ubers and they're not getting health care, but they have a job and they're paying their bills. And so I think the combination of clear messaging and the economy is going to make him the favorite right now. Sorry. I'm very sorry.
You have mentioned like the crisis of journalism we all have heard of, but here in Brazil we have few journalists who can make really investigative news. And I want to know how it is in the US. Do you have like spotlight people everywhere? In every journal you have like, it is rare, it is usual, you have everywhere. How do you work there like for 6 months or even more in one story?
So I have a colleague from BuzzFeed who is here in Brazil. I think actually he's being interviewed here today. Graciliano Rocha is the BuzzFeed bureau chief here, and he was telling me about his dog. And he has a dog, and I said, well, what's your dog's name? Well, my dog's name is Nixon. Why is your dog named Nixon? And he said, because Nixon is the man who did more for investigative journalists than anyone, maybe in history. What does he mean by that? Well, Nixon was incredibly corrupt, and an entire generation of journalists learned to be investigative journalists based on covering all his corruption, right? And it was sort of a gift to this field. And from the early to mid 1970s up for 10 years, you had this golden age of investigative journalism, with this incredible stuff was happening that all sprung out of starting to cover Nixon and being more focused on that, and it was wonderful. And in the Trump era and the Bolsonaro era, hopefully here in Brazil, we're seeing, in the Lava Jato area here in Brazil, we're hopefully seeing something similar, which is there's a very big public appetite for investigative journalism right now because people want to know the truth, whatever the truth is. And at the same time, media outlets which are in crisis are trying to figure out what's the way to still make some kind of money in this market, right? And so for a while, what they were trying to do was to have a lot of reporters writing 17 articles a day and just covering everything. So they have an article about every single topic. It's not original, it's not the first, but it is an article about the topic and it is on their website, and therefore they're part of that conversation. So now they've all moved away from that because the new feeling is what you want to do is you want to have articles that no one else has, original things that no one else has said. And that's kind of manifested in two ways. One is these opinion things that I've been whining about this whole conversation, and the other is investigative journalism, things that no one else has. So what we're seeing is newsrooms around the US that didn't have investigative teams, that didn't have a spotlight team, are now starting to build it. So I think BuzzFeed was a little bit of a pioneer in that. In 2013-14, they started this team that I'm on and grew it to 20 people. So there's 20 people on the investigations team, which is very big, I think we can agree. And of course, the New York Times had an investigations team, but they've grown it a lot. And now each of their desks, so it's not just one investigations team for the whole paper, but they have a domestic coverage investigative team. They have an international investigative team. They have a politics investigative team. They even have a sports investigative team, right? The Washington Post just announced last week they're going to hire 10 more investigative journalists. So it's sort of a trend. These trends go up and down, but the trend right now is that investigative journalism is good. Giving reporters the time to find out big secrets is good, and it's not just good for sort of the public, but it's also good for business to be distinctive, to have articles that no one else has. Someone was talking to me about Greenwald, and they said what was so smart about what he's done in this coverage with Moro and Lava Jato is he's controlled the story. I mean, you probably all heard of The Intercept before, but I don't think many people in Brazil knew about Intercept before the last month or so, right? And now it's a very famous publication here. So he got an incredible story, and he did a very smart thing, which is he put it out little by little, right? He could have put it all out in one giant story, but he put it out little by little, and the result was that he controlled the story. He had something that no one else anywhere had, and so everyone had to pay attention to Intercept and pay attention and sort of pay attention to that brand, and it's very rewarding, I think, for the concept of investigative journalism as something that can be a brand developer. Oh wait, so let me ask someone who hasn't asked the question. Okay. Yeah.
Só que você vai ter que falar, por favor, mais alto, para eu poder te ouvir e falar mais alto.
Futebol é algo relativamente novo nos Estados Unidos.
Football is relatively
Relatively new.
new.
Yeah.
Se vocês, como é que você avalia
How do you
a transparência da
assess
Federação Americana com relação às
the
outras federações
transparency
de futebol
of
e
the
a relação
US
da
team
Federação Americana com a FIFA? Se
and the
ela é
relationship
mais
of the US
transparente?
Federation towards FIFA, if it's more transparent or
Uh-huh.
not?
It's a good question. Football is relatively new to the U.S., or it's not new. It's just been very small and quiet for a long time. It's starting to become more prominent, and there is still a very dedicated following of people who believe that it's very corrupt. And in the process of researching this topic, I discovered that. Do you guys remember? Does anyone remember fractals? Was that a thing here? Fractals are these things where like a pattern replicates itself smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller over and again. And I always thought about the structure of FIFA that way, is that the problems at FIFA replicated themselves at the confederation level. And then they replicated themselves the exact same way at the National Association or the National Federation level. And that the CBF had the same kind of problems as CONMEBOL, the same problems as FIFA. And the US, even though it's the US and we're supposed to be transparent or something, had the exact same kind of problems. There is a whole dedicated following of obsessives about the United States Soccer Federation and how corrupt it is. And I get probably more tips from those people than anything else, and they all want me to write a book about the corruption in the U.S. Soccer Federation. I can tell you that I like to pay my bills and pay the rent in my house, and I don't think that book is going to sell enough copies for me to do that. But I think in fact there is a serious problem, to directly answer your question, with the U.S. Soccer Federation. The complexities of why that is maybe are too boring for most people in this audience, and I can talk to you more after if you want to, but in rough terms, the professional soccer league in the U.S., Major League Soccer, and the United States Soccer Federation don't have an arm's length relationship. They are totally intertwined like this. And that the people who have a financial interest in the sport also control the board, the Cámara Directiva of the United States Soccer Federation. And they control where it sells its rights. And the Soccer Federation, which should be able to sell them to anywhere, sells them always to the marketing company of the professional soccer league. And it sells it for a price that everyone thinks is probably way too low, and it becomes its number one source of income. So there is a tremendous conflict of interest with the U.S. Soccer team and its commercial rights. And it is kind of a scandal, but it hasn't gotten much attention. And everyone was sort of always hoping that the prosecutors in the FIFA case would look at that. But from their perspective, it wasn't something they were looking at. So there wasn't really any looking into that. It's still out there. It's a conflict of interest. Some people believe that the the nonprofit status of the U.S. Soccer Federation should be taken away because it's corrupt as well. And if you want to talk later, we could do that. I can falo pouquinho português.
So, you work in two very different vehicles.
Yeah.
At LA Times and I'm working at BuzzFeed News.
Yeah.
What were the major editorial differences you suffered?
So, the LA Times still sells a print newspaper, even today, and it's trying to get away, slowly away from that. But the conventions. Has anyone here ever worked at a print paper? A couple of people. The conventions of a print newspaper, okay, a chunk of people, are sort of very rigid and formal because it's a question of space, right? Stories have to fit in a specific space in a paper, and when you different papers measure it in different ways, but we used to measure our stories at the newspaper in inches, like in centimetros, no? And so they would measure the story in how many inches long it was. That was how you talk about it. And they would say, if it's, again, a strange concept for someone who hasn't worked in a newspaper, but you would go to your editor and you would say, oh, well, I have this story about how this company did this thing and it's a new deal and whatever. And they would say, great, that's 22 inches, right? That seems like 22 inches. Give me 22 inches. That's how we talk about it. And so stories are structured that way. And no story was ever longer than about 75 or 80 inches, right? So one of the great big changes, particularly when I started in like 2014 and 15, was this liberdade, no? This like ability to write much longer, right? So my story about Chuck Blazer that I mentioned was 8,000 or 9,000 words. I'd never written anything that long before, right? And we subsequently, not me, but another person on my team, published an article that was 25,000 words, right? 25,000 words is like a short book, one article. Her first draft was 150,000 words, so that's like a long book. And so there's a tremendous sense of freedom of what you can do, but that can be a bad thing as well, right? We've all read stories that are way too long, and that go on and on and on. So the other big change was that there's this desire at a digital media to be in the conversation, to be at the front of it all the time. So there's less editing. In general, not on my investigation sheet, but in general, BuzzFeed, there's less editing. Things are faster. Things are looser. They're less concerned about the grammar and the spelling being perfect and all these things that took some adjustment to. But there's also, in general, it's just been a liberating experience. It's been the opportunity to cover things in a new way, to cover topics that I never would have been allowed to at the paper, and to take risks I never would have had to, because newspapers, I think, tend to be very conservative. I mean, we published this dossier. No newspaper was going to publish that. In fact, several newspapers had it and refused to publish it. So it's a place that will take risks, and it's a place also that is less afraid of falling on its face sometimes when it makes a mistake. I think in general it's been a really great experience, but also I've been really fortunate because BuzzFeed has supported investigative journalism and has supported basically hiring old men like me who have all kinds of bills to pay, and so they're providing for someone who's a little bit more expensive and a little bit slower than you young Pumas.
I'd like to ask you about a BuzzFeed News article that was said was not very correct.
Uh-huh.
One about how Trump directed Michael Cohen to lie.
Uh-huh.
And what was the conversation inside BuzzFeed when that got out and other news outlets started saying that was not quite true?
Yeah. So the co-author of that article is Jason Leopold, who's a good friend of mine. He sits right next to me at work, and he's a great journalist. Abraji should have him here in the future. He's one of the best users of freedom and public information laws. Public access to information laws. He's sort of a genius at it, right? I sit next to him, and it's incredible. Every week the mail cart comes by with like 50 envelopes of more things he's got, and then he gets them by email, and he has an entire email account of just hundreds of documents coming in every single day. It's incredible what he's done that way, and I think prior to that, he's probably most famous because you clearly follow these topics closely. he was responsible for getting the first info out about Hillary Clinton's emails. So he often jokes that when he gets criticized for his coverage of Trump, people should remember he also, caused the whole Hillary Clinton email nightmare. But the story he's mentioning was that they ran an article saying that Michael Cohen, whose picture we saw earlier, lied to Congress, which we knew, which is true. He pleaded guilty to lying to Congress, which is it's a serious criminal offense in the U.S., and he's currently in prison for that. But the article said that he didn't just decide to lie by himself, but that Trump told him to lie, right? Well, another criminal offense is called suborning perjury. It's telling someone to lie under oath, and that's a pretty serious criminal offense as well. And the article said that Trump told him to lie, and that the prosecutors had evidence that he was told to lie. And if that were true, it's a big deal, because it would be just with all the noise we've heard about Trump, it would be the first time we heard about prosecutors having evidence of him actually committing a crime, right? We'd heard lots of accusations, but never that the prosecutors had this evidence that he did it. The article exploded, and for 20 hours it was this giant thing, and everyone was excited about it. And then this really terrible thing happened, which was that the special prosecutor put out a statement, which they never do. They never talk. And the statement said, that story's not right. And they wouldn't say why it wasn't right. They just said it wasn't right. And it was a disaster. And I will tell you, the reaction has been really tough. For Jason, it's probably the worst moment in his career, and he's had a few. He's had a long and complicated career. For his colleague, it was really bad, who was a reporter who had a less complicated career and had never had a serious problem before, and it was this shock to have something really negative happen. BuzzFeed came under a lot of criticism for it, and I think it's fair. I think that story had lots of correct information in it, but I think it pushed things a little bit too far. We had I'm just giving you all kinds of weird idiomatic American expressions today. The one I use for that one it's called getting out in front of your skis, right? And I know how much Brazilians love to ski. All the snow and mountains you have everywhere. But getting out in front of your skis, if you can sort of imagine, is if you lean too far forward over your skis, what's going to happen? You're going to fall on your face. So the expression, getting it too far your skis, is if you have one and you have two, and you write three. You don't have three yet. You just have one and two. But one and two are pointing in the direction of three, and so you say, well, I'm going to write three. And that's, I think what's happened in that story is it was just a little bit more than they really had. Very marginal, but it looks really wrong. And the other, there's another expression, which is if you're gonna shoot at the king, you better not miss, right? And I think that was unfortunately an example of shooting at the king and missing, and regrettable. I mean, I wish it had been different. I think it was, as someone at BuzzFeed who isn't on that story, it's affected me. People have told me that they're concerned about talking to people at BuzzFeed because we get stories wrong, and people refuse to talk to me about it, and it affects all of our reputation. So I guess maybe it's a good lesson for all of us. And I will say, to defend Jason and the others, it was in good faith. It wasn't a mistake. I mean, it wasn't a intentional mistake, right? It wasn't fake news. It wasn't an intent to mislead anyone. It was maybe a bit of cognitive bias, maybe a little bit of wanting something to be true, hearing what you want to hear from your sources, this sort of thing.
That's it then.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Someday maybe you can get my book in Brazil, but no. It's really exciting to see this conference, and also, this is the second or third time I've spoken to a group of younger journalists in South America, and I got to say, you guys are really great audiences. You're really great, like the enthusiasm you have for journalism and all of that. I did a speech last November in Buenos Aires, and it's just like an intensity and energy about it. Sometimes when I speak to young journalists in the U.S., there's no questions, right? And everyone, some of you have your phones out, that's fine, but everyone's on their phones. No one's paying attention. They're just in the energy. So it's really a treat. It's really cool to see this. So thanks for having me. I'm really appreciative. And if any of you want to talk to me, which I like, you're welcome to do so.